Hello, everyone. In this video titled Free Will is an Illusion, I'd like to talk about free will, the idea of free will, and the main stumbling block, the main problem that the proponents of free will have had to deal with throughout the discussions of free will in the philosophical tradition. And the idea that poses a kind of threat to the very existence of free will, the objective existence of something we would call free will, whatever that is, whatever allows us to control our lives or feel like we're the agents of our own behavior, we're the cause of our own behavior. The idea that opposes free will is called determinism. And so in this video, what I'd like to do is present the most powerful, the strongest case for determinism, and to get you to thinking about how it presents an obstacle and how you might, if you wish to believe in free will, how you might overcome this uh, deterministic view. So to get us started on this topic, I'd like you to ask these questions throughout. First, to begin with, do you have free will? Do you believe you have free will? What does that mean? And of course, natural question to ask is, what do we even mean by free will? Is it a kind of cause? Is it some spontaneous way in which we decide between options? What do we mean by free will? So now for the concept of determinism, often opposed to free will, although some philosophers believe that even if the universe is determined, there's still room for free will. The idea of determinism was really formulated, presented in its strongest form by polymath, mathematician, scientist Pierre-Simon de Laplace, who was kind of founder, the inventor of what we would call probability theory today. So here in this quote, famous quote, he presents this what has been termed Laplace's demon. You might think, what is it with philosophers and demons? Interesting question, but here Laplace is just using the idea of a demon to stand in for an all-knowing being that sort of has infinite capacity to hold information, data, and analyze it. So this is what Laplace writes. He says, we may regard the present state of the universe as the effects of its past and the cause of its future. So what does he mean here? So imagine taking a slice of the universe, the whole universe, at any instant in time. Every particle, every object in this universe, in this slice of time, will have a specific state, definable state, and a fact about the state. And if you know all the information, where every bit is, whether it's a particle or a bundle of fields, energy fields, if you know that moment, that state in the moment of the universe, and you know the rules by which one moment transitions into the next and then the next, then using those two pieces of information, you can deduce with absolute exactness and predict any future state and equally derive any past. In fact, there is no difference between past and future and even present. So the universe is completely predictable because it follows very exact rules. Specific states it is in at any given moment. So he writes further. An intellect which at any given moment knew all of the forces that animate nature and the mutual positions of the beings that compose it, beings to cities to planets. If this intellect were vast enough to submit the data to analysis, could condense into a single formula the movement of the greatest bodies of the universe and that of the lightest. For such an intellect, nothing could be uncertain, and the future, just like the past, would be present before its eyes. The universe is completely determined. It seems to us as if there are possibilities and routes that we can take and adjustments caused by our choices or by our will. In fact, it's just a function of us not being demons, not knowing everything at once. But if they're in principle, it's the whole universe is calculatable, and even you yourself and your life is just caused by previous states of the universe going all the way to the beginning of the universe. That's the kind of the powerful idea of determinism. There's nothing new. There's nothing that spontaneously appears. And so, of course, if the universe is determined in this way, it's very hard to see how there would be something we could meaningfully call free will. So you might have the following question. Well, if it's so determined that particles just move in predictable ways, absolutely predictable ways, how is it possible to have such an elaborate, complex universe of animals and human beings and cultures from just these simple bits following simple rules? So I would like to give you an example, show you a video of what is called Game of Life, Conway's Game of Life. This was designed by John Conway in the 70s. It's called, often referred to um, as cellular automata. And it's just a grid of pixels that turn on and off, are either white or black, and that follow basic, very basic rules that takes just a few lines of code to program. And the point is that out of this determined, fully determined simulation, you get very elaborate patterns and very elaborate designs. That's the point.
So here's the animation, and first there are the rules for the game of life, Conway's game of life. This universe is just a grid of pixels that turn on and off, or live or dead, white or black. And they follow, again, simple rules. There are 8 neighbors for each pixel, right? And depending on which pixels are on or off, it influences the pixel itself, whose neighbors there are, right? So any live cell with 2 or 3 live neighbors lives on to the next generation, ticks over to the next generation. Any live cell, white on cell, with more than 3 live neighbors disappears, turns black, dies. And any dead cell with exactly 3 live neighbors becomes alive, so it turns from black to white. So now you'll see the patterns that have been discovered by all sorts of people who were fascinated by this game. So what you see on the screen are 2 gliders, what's called gliders, and it's just a simple design of 6 or 7 pixels that turn on and off, and they kind of glide or move. What you see also is what's called an engine, right, that creates gliders, right? It just infinitely produces gliders. You have 2 engines producing gliders in opposite directions, and the gliders, when they collide, destroy one another. Right? Here's even several engines like this, right? So this is the pattern is getting more elaborate. And here you can see how complicated this can get. It's almost like looking through a microscope, where you have these creatures. They're almost like bacteria. They look like, right? You have this vast pattern that generates these elaborate, much more elaborate gliders, right? And this can go on and on. And there are all sorts of objects that have been discovered by enthusiasts. And it's been proven that actually you can design a kind of processor, a calculator, just from the pixels, which is fascinating, right? You can get uh, basically infinitely complex patterns from just these pixels, this world of pixels that follow four simple rules that takes just a few lines of code to program. Right? Uh, so it gets more and more elaborate. As you can see, almost like these little animals that move along. Right? So this goes to the idea that uh, that you can get very complex, very elaborate patterns from very simple uh, rules guiding the particles at any given moment, and that determines how one moment transitions into the next. This, of course, world is fully determined if you know the state of the system, which pixels are on or off at any given generation, any given moment. Then you can know everything about the future, a million or even a billion generations into the future, as long as you have a strong enough processor calculator. Right? So this system is fully determined, but produces very intricate results, patterns.
Now, I'd like to tell you about a very influential, very important for the discussions of free will uh, experiment, neurobiological experiment, if you like. And this experiment was conducted by Benjamin Libet in the 1980s, and subsequently his discussions of the experiment, and many philosophers have weighed in on this experiment, on the results of this experiment, whether we have free will truly. And uh, it this experiment puts a lot of pressure on the idea that indeed we have something like free will. So here's the experiment that Libet conducted. This is the abstract on your screen, but the point that Libet makes is that what we think of as intentions, when we become aware of wanting to do something and then do it, take some action. In fact, the cause of those actions is not our intentions, not our efforts, but unconscious forces that we don't know about and don't have control over. So when we feel like we're in control, we really not. Even our thought of this control is itself caused by a previous state of our body. So here's what the experiment looked like. Libet took the subjects for this experiment and hooked them up to EEG machines, machines that monitor the processes and activity in the brain. Then he asked them to perform a simple action like pressing a button or flexing their wrist, right? A movement. We would think that we can do freely. We can do it or not do it. We are in control of it some way. This is the idea of free will, that we decide when we want to flex our wrist or press a button. Libet also asked the subjects to note when they decided to press the button or flex their wrist. I'll say press a button. When did they decide? And he showed them this sort of clock, right? A timer of sorts. And what the subjects were asked to do is to note at which number they decided to press the button. Right? And there's, of course, delay between deciding and pressing it. So you can imagine now, right, at 30 or now at 20, and I'm pressing the button at that moment, right? Or, yeah, pressing the button. So here are the results, or here's the result that Libet got. Right? So this shows the timing of the action, here, and then the awareness of the intention over here, right? And of course, there's a kind of gap of 200 milliseconds, so about a fifth of a second. Right? But what Libet discovered is before this awareness came into consciousness of these subjects, there already was a rise in voltage recorded by the EEG machine in the brain. And in this sort of initiation of the process, which then causes the intention and the action, was unconscious and started about half a second before the action, right? And about a third of a second before the awareness of taking the action was noted by the subject. And so, in other words, Libet could be like the demon, but in a localized kind of sense. He can predict when the subject was going to actually press the button before the subject themselves knew that they were going to press the button. So, what kind of free will could that possibly be, right? Something in us beyond our control, beyond our actual awareness, is actually starting to make us move before we even can know about it. And somebody else can, by just recording our brain activity, predict what we will do. So an implication is, why not, if we know enough about the brain, why not we can, or about the body generally, we could perhaps predict what you're going to eat for breakfast and whether you're going to be late or not, and perhaps even who you're going to marry. Right? That's a kind of expanded idea, almost like a, you know, a powerful neuroscientist can kind of do this, right? Because again, your actions are determined by all sorts of causes that might have been active way in the past without your conscious awareness. So philosophers have struggled with this with this experiment and debated whether, in fact, it shows that we have no free will. And Libet himself came down on this kind of that it still leaves space for something like free will, but in a very sort of adjusted ways. We have to rethink our common sense ways of thinking about free will, and we're fully in control of our actions. Now, you might ask, okay, but what is this feeling? What is this sense that I am acting? It's me, I'm causing my own behavior, not something else, within me. Let's say some hormonal or neurotransmitter uh, excretion or something, right? So, what is this sense that I'm still free? And here, Baruch Spinoza, a um, famous, even infamous philosopher from the 17th century, he actually overlapped and was very much influenced by Rene Descartes. In one of his texts, he writes the following, which is a very powerful also idea for to make sense of what explains this feeling, or how do we make sense of this feeling that I'm actually, or this thought that I'm actually doing, flexing the wrist or choosing what breakfast to eat. So here's what he says: further conceive, I beg, that a stone, while continuing in motion, let's say rolling down a hill, obviously it didn't cause itself to roll downhill. Something knocked it over and it's rolling down. While the stone, while continuing in motion, should be capable of thinking and knowing that it is endeavoring, as far as it can, to continue to move. Right? So imagine a stone that's self-aware of what is happening to it. Such a stone, being conscious merely of its own endeavor and not at all indifferent, would believe itself to be completely free. In other words, I am doing this, I am rolling, I want to be rolling Right? That's what the stone is sort of internally telling itself. This is that human freedom, which all boast that they possess, and which consists solely in the fact that men are conscious of their own desire, but are ignorant of the causes whereby that desire has been determined. In other words, we're aware of what we want to do, and we feel that we're generating some effort into doing, attaining what we desire. But in fact, our desires are themselves caused, and our motivations are caused by unseen, sort of underground forces below the level of consciousness that we don't have control over. So we're determined by those forces, and even our desires and awareness of our own uh, effort are just determined, right? They're just sort of what's called epiphenomena, right? They're not actually causing, they're just sort of the also sort of float above the actual mechanism that makes us move. So we're kind of like the stone that's telling itself, oh, I'm going to roll down the hill now. But in fact, another stone knocking us uh, off our perch is making us roll down the hill. So this is kind of what is suggested by the Libet experiment also. But now, taking a step, there are several other experiments that are, inspired or influenced by Libet, and these are very interesting sort of behavioral experiments. Two that I want to share with you, and the second one building off of Libet, but also building off of this second one. So here's the title of the article: "The Value of Believing in Free Will. Encouraging a belief in determinism increases cheating." Right, and this is by Kathleen Vo and Jonathan School. I won't go into the abstract, you can read it if you like. But basically, the experiment tested what if we convince people that they are determined, that they have no choice, that they have no free will? How is it going to actually impact their behavior, if at all? And to give it away, they cheated more on a kind of standardized test. So let me tell you how this experiment was set up and how it was conducted, just basics of it. Now, two groups of subjects, one control group and one that was tested. The first group was given an article that basically a kind of magazine article you might encounter online or something like this that argued that free will is an illusion. It's just a figment of our imagination, like the stone telling itself that it's going to roll downhill. So they were given this article to read, while the second group was just unrelated article, right? It's a control group. The subjects were then asked to fill out a questionnaire about their beliefs in free will, in both groups. And then the subjects were asked to take a kind of unrelated test, unrelated to free will, just a test in kind of more or less straightforward arithmetic, right? Challenging, but not impossible for just an average kind of adult. Now, the experiment was set up in such a way that there was a kind of opportunity to cheat, right? Maybe there was a sheet of answers just outside the vision of the subject they could kind of glance at and get the answers, and they thought, it was left by accident or something like this, or cheat off of a neighbor or something, right? So the result was pretty interesting. Out of 20 problems, there were 20 problems on this test. The free will belief weakened group, in other words, those who read the article arguing that free will is an illusion, cheated on 14 out of the 20. Whereas the control group, the neutral group, only cheated on about 10 of the problems on average, right? So this is a significant result in the sense that uh, those whose belief in free will was weakened by the article they read cheated much more. Interesting. Why is that? So the conclusion that Vo and Schooler make is that when people stop believing they are free agents, that they're responsible for their actions, then they stop seeing themselves as blameworthy. They stop seeing themselves as responsible, right? So it just, my brain made me do it, so I can cheat, right? I'm not to blame for cheating. So a very fascinating, I think, result, and it's been tested. And there's again, there's always debate about whether the experimental setup and what it actually shows. I think it's at the very least very interesting that our beliefs in free will and our capacities, maybe our moral convictions, actually have an influence on what we do, our actions. Now, do we ourselves choose to believe in certain values or in our responsibility, right? So you can ask a kind of second order question. What determines whether the subjects walked away from reading the article on free will uh, in a more skeptical way towards free will, right? They were perhaps determined in that way also. So in other words, it's they didn't make up their mind that they were less blameworthy. It just sort of caused them to be because of the article, and even that might have been predictable if you knew sort of the layout of their brain. Perhaps, right? You can still uh, recover a kind of strong determinism. Okay, so that's the first experiment. Now, few questions. What do you think the experiment actually shows? What are the implications for free will from that experiment? Should we, even if free will is an illusion, should we still convince or try to convince or sort of deceive people, especially, let's say, children, right? Deceive them in some way or disguise this truth that free will is an illusion in order for them to be more moral agents and to hold themselves responsible, right? So should we believe in free will even if it is an illusion? Now, there's a second experiment which, through some doubt on the Vaux-Schooler experiment, but actually what it tested was what if people believe that others are determined, that they don't have free will? What is the consequence moral behavior from that belief? Right. So this is again the abstract, and I'll just read one quote from the abstract. They write, "Our belief our results show that participants who were primed with a text defending neural determinism, my brain makes me do things without my control, the idea that humans are a mere bunch of neurons guided by their biology, administered fewer shocks and were less vindictive toward the other participant." So, what is the setup of the experiment? So here's a kind of uh, sketch or drawing of what the experiment setup looked like. It in some ways mimics, if you know of this famous Stanley Milgram experiment from the 60s, where a subject was told by an authority figure to administer shocks to another person who was actually an actor, but the subjects didn't know it was an actor, right? Administer shocks, of small electric shocks, to the learner if the learner got some answer wrong. Right? Stanley Milgram's experiment is very interesting. This one sort of tested how likely a subject is administers an electric shock, depending on whether they believe in free will or not. So here's the result. To conclude, we observed that disbelief in free will had a positive impact on the morality of decisions toward others. In other words, those subjects who read an article arguing that free will is an illusion, people are determined in what they do, they were more empathetic perhaps, or more moral towards the learners who were asked to learn a test or do answer questions on a kind of test, and were shocked if they got things wrong. So the subjects actually were less likely to shock or punish the learner if they believe there's no free will. Right? So we hold others less responsible when we think they weren't in charge, they didn't cause their own behaviors, right? Something else did. Right? They couldn't help it, in other words. So you see, not only is it possible that we're determined, but perhaps our beliefs about free will are also determined. And yet, nevertheless, whether we believe in free will can have positive or negative effects for how we actually behave, especially behaving towards others versus ourselves. So again, perhaps even if free will is an illusion, and there's a philosopher, Smolensky, who argues just for this, that we should still convince ourselves that we are free, we do have free will, even if we don't have objective evidence. So perhaps believing in free will is a kind of self-fulfilling theory. The more we believe in free will, the more our behavior can be influenced in certain directions. Right? Now, as an aside, I'll just say this is a key notion as far as I'm concerned. That we aren't just cause, we're determined. We're determined by our biology, by our genetics, right? But we're also influenced or determined by our culture, by things we learn from our parents and our friends. Not just in our development when we're a fetus, where we have no control over the kind of stimuli and the kind of hormones that circulate through the fetus's body, or when we're an infant or a toddler, we have very little control over what we do. We don't do things intentionally for the most part. There's a kind of spontaneity of toddlers, the way we think of it usually, right? But as we grow up, we gather all sorts of beliefs, and those beliefs give us can influence what we do. Now, does that mean we're not determined? I think it just means that we are determined by certain things. And the more we are determined by reasons or beliefs, which is a very different, we're not caused perhaps. A reason is a very interesting kind of cause. I can be influenced by reasons. I interpret reasons in certain ways, which then show up in my behavior. Now, I want to leave you with a quote by a neuroscientist, neurobiologist, Robert Sapolsky. He's, I think, brilliant scientist and a brilliant teacher, in fact. He um, has a whole course on biology of human behavior on YouTube. It's about 27 lectures. I really recommend it. He's brilliant. He teaches at Stanford. He studied baboons, actually, great the apes, and has very interesting results there. And he also wrote a book called Behave, where he goes into biology of our behavior. And recently he has published a book, I believe last year. So here it is, I'll show you. And this book is called Determined. Right? And he argues there, we're determined. There is no room for free will. So here's his kind of thesis in the book that he argues for. And it's, as you can see, a very thick book. I'm still working through it, but I've watched interviews with him and debates, and I recommend a debate between him and Daniel Dennett, who's a philosopher who kind of believed in determinism on the one hand, but also thought there's room for free will within that our determined universe. Sapolsky doesn't agree. He thinks we're not actually in control of our actions the way we think we are, right? You're determined by all sorts of things. So here's a quote from his book. He says, you cannot decide all the sensory stimuli in your environment, your hormone levels this morning, whether something traumatic happened to you in the past, the socioeconomic status of your parents, your fetal environment, your genes, whether your ancestors were farmers or herders. Those are all things that cause you to act and behave in certain ways. Maybe even determine whether you like philosophy or not, right? So in that situation, for me to demand or want or desire even for you to enjoy philosophy and to read, for example, are misplaced. You have no choice, and neither do I have any choice really. So that's the implication. Sapolsky admits that this is very difficult to actually accept and to live by. He thinks it's the objective truth about our condition. So he writes further, let me say this most broadly, probably at this point too broadly for most readers. He says, we are nothing more nor less than the cumulative biological and environmental luck, just contingent factors, just coincidences, just these genetics within this culture developed in this way because of what happened to your mother and your father, let's say. We are nothing more nor less than the cumulative biological and environmental luck over which we had no control, and it has brought us to uh, any and every moment in our lives. Right? And again, if there was a kind of demon or a scientist with vast knowledge and vast information about all of these factors, they'd be able to predict what you're going to do, what you're going to eat for breakfast, what kind of partner you're going to have, whether you're going to have children or not, and also when you're going to die potentially. Right? Of course, this is uh, a huge amount of information, right? But you're nevertheless determined by it. All right, that's it for this video. Thank you very much if you stuck around till the very end. Thank you.